So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the attendees of the webinar, wherever you might be in the world. Thank you for joining today's webinar. And today we're going to discuss how to simplify Kubernetes platforms with the management as a service paradigm. My name is Vamsi Kemtiganti, and I'll be your moderator and co-presenter today. And I work on the strategy team at Platform 9 here, and I'm pretty excited to be hosting today's session. And in a second, I'll introduce Peter Frey, my co-speaker. Peter's the field CTO at Platform 9 and heads all the post-sales and pre-sales delivery teams here. And Peter and I have done a whole bunch of webinars together, and we've been pretty much at Platform 9 for the last almost 3 years. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items to cover about the presentation. First of all, today's webinar is going to be available or made available on demand after the live session. And it should be accessible using the same Zoom link that you're using at this point. And as part of the downloads for the webinar, we're going to also include some attachments, which will be made available. And then that'll include related content such as blog posts, white papers. And as you all might know, Platform 9 is one of the thought leaders in the whole Kubernetes and the containerization space. So you'll find a lot of valuable content there, more technical than marketing. That's what we strive to do. And we'd also love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for one of us, or or a general question, feel free to send it to the chat window or the ask a question tab that you'll see there. And we'll be answering questions at the end of the session. And again, if we don't have the time to get through to the question by the end of the webinar, we'll be able to follow up. And again, finally, just share this in your social networks. You'll have the sharing icons there. Post this on Twitter, LinkedIn, or even Facebook. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn things off to Peter to talk over about a poll, and then we'll go through the introductions and then carry on with the rest of the webinar today. Peter?
Great, if we can start the poll. There we go. So we have a poll set of questions that we're going to be asking. Please take a few minutes to answer these questions. It really helps us, excuse me, really helps us tailor the presentation to our attendees to the webinar today. And we'll go over the results here in just a minute. While the poll's in progress, and you guys are taking some time to answer that, we'll go into some introductions. Vamsi started this, but we'll just start. My name is Peter Frey. I'm a field CTO here at Platform 9 Systems. I manage worldwide pre-sales as well as our worldwide post-sales teams here at Platform 9. I've been with Platform 9 Systems for a little over 2.5 years. I've been working with Kubernetes and containerization, various technologies in the space for the last 5 years or so. And so I'm presenting to you today from sunny Florida, and looking forward to talking to everybody. Vamsi?
Thanks, Peter. So team Vamsi here, Chief of Strategy at Platform 9. And in the course of my 2-decade career, I've primarily been at open source companies. I did a stint at Siemens to start with for 8 years, and pretty much was the open source guy there. And then went to Red Hat for about a decade almost, and then was one of the original people on both OpenShift and OpenStack and associated cloud technologies such as CloudForm/ManageIQ. And then Hortonworks for 2 years, leading the big data platform for financial services customers. And then after that, basically at Platform 9. And traditionally in my day-to-day, I work with customers across verticals. So if you go to my blog at Vamsi Talks Tech, I'm pretty big on vertical stories. It's a lot of work in financial services, insurance, telco, manufacturing. But again, my charter here is to understand what are the kinds of business problems our customers are looking to solve in different verticals, and help applying containerization, infrastructure as a service, and Kubernetes to the same. So again, looking forward to an engaging session where we're going to discuss some real world challenges in running Kubernetes platforms at scale.
All right, let's stop our poll and review the answers here. So I'm going to end the poll. So everybody that took a few minutes to respond to the poll, I appreciate it. Uh, we have a few questions. I'll review them. The first question is, where are you in your Kubernetes journey? And 60% of our respondents responded with just getting started. I think, I talk to people every single day in my day-to-day job, prospects and customers of Platform 9. And, I think almost everybody that I talk to is on the journey to Kubernetes somewhere. And we'll talk a lot about that later today. But I think the majority of organizations are trying to figure out what the impact of Kubernetes is going to be with their customers and or within their organization, I should say. And so I'm not surprised with the getting started. Bob, any thoughts there?
No, so yeah, that's fairly standard based on what we're seeing with our customer base, Peter. So again, we'll pick up on the thread as we go through the webinar, but good point.
The second question is, where do you plan on running your Kubernetes? Multiple choice. This surprises me a little bit. Most people that are just beginning their journey with Kubernetes tend to pick public clouds, but today we had 67% of our respondents respond with on-premise, which I think is awesome. I think that might be a trend that we're starting to see, Vamsi, where more and more people are moving away from the public cloud due to public cloud costs and things like that, and running things in their local data centers. So, Vamsi, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think there's two things there, right, Peter? People are figuring out that running a data center in the public cloud isn't exactly a cost-effective proposition, number one. And number two, the fact is that servers Moore's law always applies, but in the private cloud, you got a choice of running things on bare metal or running things on a VM platform. I think that's one of the key themes we'll hit today, is to be agnostic to Kubernetes distro itself should be agnostic to whatever is running on the host, whether that's that's traditionally public cloud, a lot of it, but starting to see more and more shift back towards the private cloud and even the edge for that matter.
Yep. And number 3 question here was, what's your biggest challenge with managing Kubernetes? And it's a multiple choice one as well, but again, 56%, no surprise, is managing high availability and reliability. I think everybody we talk to is trying to figure out how we're going to take an app, deploy it on Kubernetes. Once we deploy it, how are we going to get it in production? What does that mean? Who has access to doing that? And all of the kind of day 2 operations that are wrapped around maintaining a Kubernetes cluster. So I think that reliability is a key factor. Vamsi?
No, I agree. So the one thing that if I could take away, right, if I could provide the audiences takeaways, there's no business value just maintaining clusters, right? The business value is in the application. And to that end, when you start setting up Kubernetes, you've got 1 or 2 Mickey Mouse apps, that's great. But when it starts to go into real-time production with multiple apps, high availability and reliability is key in making sure that your business is up. And Kubernetes is complicated, right? And we'll talk about some of that. But the idea is that if you look at the poll, Peter, obviously the HA and the reliability and the geo redundancy are very important, but also the monitoring and the troubleshooting. They're pretty close seconds in terms of the votes that the audience has provided. Is to be able to do things around monitoring, whether it's Prometheus or some of the closed source tools, or making sure that you're troubleshooting the clusters. And I think you'll cover a lot of that in today's talk. Is that all right?
We will. All right, last final question was, how do you plan to manage Kubernetes? And overwhelmingly, it was 77% of people responded with they want to do it self-managed with open source Kubernetes distributions. Bobson, what do you think about that?
Yeah, DIY tends to be the major way to do it. And then distributions, I've got different opinions on distributions because I've done this once before. And maybe 2 years ago, there's some value in saying Kubernetes in and of itself isn't robust or mature. But now, I don't think there's a need to wrap or modify or fork Kubernetes. The CNCF Kubernetes runs across a wide range of customers that we work with, whether it's in telco, banking, insurance, manufacturing, web scale, e-commerce, so on and so forth. So in my mind, Kubernetes itself is enough, but the question then becomes, how do you wrap around a viable, scalable, and more importantly, cost-effective, managed service around it? And that's what we'll focus on today.
Great. So we at Platform 9 appreciate everybody's attendance to these webinars, and we have great attendance today. So we are going to be giving out a prize at the end of the webinar. You must be present at the end of the webinar to win the prize, but it's a Saturn V Lego kit, and we'll get your contact information after the webinar, and we'll ship that to you. So please stay to the end and you get a chance to win a nice prize. So Vamsi, you want to cover the goals for the webinar?
Sure. So what we're going to do today is, number one, talk about what is the need for a management platform for Kubernetes. And for those of you who are DIYing this at this point, things are probably working well, one or two applications. But as things start to roll out and things get more and more serious, you put consumer-facing applications or revenue-producing applications on the platform, management does start to become a bit of a challenge. So it becomes a challenge in a few different ways that we'll talk about. Number one, as we keep hiring people, and Kubernetes talent isn't cheap, you'll start to see that the cost of the platform isn't just what you're paying with the vendor if you're working with a commercial distribution for the expensive licenses, but also the number of people you're going to be hiring that all factors into your TCO. So we'll talk about why a management platform is needed for Kubernetes. And then Peter's going to talk about the Kubernetes journey. And this is something that a lot of our customers feel very passionate about. What Peter's done is explained from a technologist perspective. We're talking about somebody right in the trenches who's trying to deliver Kubernetes capabilities and containerization to the business. And talk about what are some of these key things that are going to be that you'll run into in your journey. And then you have a choice of going through the whole journey or just going through something like a managed service, right? And we'll talk about why managed Kubernetes, we feel, is the answer to a lot of these burning issues that you'll face to ensure that your business runs smoothly. And now more than ever post-COVID, because everything's online world and your online apps are your sort of corporate destiny, right? And then we'll talk about Platform 9, and we'll talk about our architecture approach to management as a service. And then we'll do some conclusions and we'll wrap up with some questions.
Sounds good.
Perfect. So, Peter, any other color commentary to add there on the agenda before we get started?
Nope. I think we're good. We'll just jump in. What's the need for the managed Kubernetes?
No, it's a great question. So if you look at this diagram, it's a pretty awfully busy pictorial representation of two things, right? On the left side, you've got core Kubernetes, which is what we all agree is the framework, the project, and the great things it can provide. But on the right side, there's a whole notion of what are the other things needed to Kubernetes, around Kubernetes, right? To basically make it consumable in a large enterprise, in the private cloud, or maybe if you're doing the public cloud, they support some of these semantics, right? So again, the argument we're trying to make here, the argument we're proposing here is that in and of itself, Kubernetes is great. But when you try to expose it to the business, and we're talking tens to hundreds of developers to thousands of developers, different lines of business, you have to think about all the things on the right to ensure that you're set up for success. Now you have a choice of whether you want to build the right side yourself or you want to use a managed service, right? So let's talk about it, right? So looking at the left side, we all know what Kubernetes is, but again, for those of you who are new to containerization, it's basically a portable, extensible platform created in the open source world. And it provides a way to manage containerized workloads and services. So the idea with Kubernetes is pretty much everything you do in the platform is based on declarative configuration and automation. And it's basically a Google project that got open sourced in 2014. And it uses about 15 years of Google's experience running production grade workloads, right? And a lot of best practice ideas and from the community as well, after it got moved over to the CNCF as incubator, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Now, core Kubernetes on the left is a complex beast, right? You've got the notion of containers, and you got pods, who are the group of containers, and pods are basically equivalent to a VM. And then you've got different ways of deploying apps, replica sets, deployments, a way to kind of front your app using a service construct, labels for metadata, ingress controllers, so on and so forth, right? So, and then there's other concepts like service mesh, storage, networking, etc. But when you take an app and deploy it using Kubernetes, you want to be able to have the app be consumable and then deployable to your existing investments, whether they're bare metal, virtualized, or cloud, right? So on the right side, we propose that a management as a service platform should include things like, number one, self-service, number two, automation. So the one key thing that Peter and our teams talk about when they talk to customers is, if you're building a Kubernetes platform, but you have an unsustainably low VM to admin ratio or pod to admin ratio, then you're really not cloud native. All you've done is taken your technical debt and moved it to containers and increase your cost. Automation basically deals with that aspect of things, where as you can run an insanely high number of pods at a very low number of admins, right? So you keep your people cost extremely low. And then serverless functions, right? Are you going to be able to offer value-added services on top of Kubernetes, such as functions as a service? What about monitoring, right? When people deploy their apps, developers deploy their apps, these are 24/7 monitoring available. And then site reliability, which is a new term. All that means is that engineers should be available who could basically, participate in DevOps, but also fix things. So again, service catalogs for applications, so on and so forth. So the idea of the management of the service is that all of the right side stuff should be included with Kubernetes. Now, Peter, do you agree to that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you start with Kubernetes, but then you're starting to build an ecosystem of Kubernetes tools around Kubernetes, right? So when you start thinking about that, that means, monitoring. What am I going to do for monitoring? Prometheus and Grafana or whatever. Or maybe logging, you're looking at Splunk, or there's some other tools that are out there, right? What about CI/CD, and how are you going to push your apps back and forth to your Kubernetes cluster or clusters, right? We're finding more people are managing not just one cluster, but multiple smaller clusters these days. And then where are you going to run it? So it becomes very quickly a huge ecosystem of not just Kubernetes, not just your app, but all the stuff around it that you need to be able to run a Kubernetes cluster effectively in production.
So with that in mind, thanks, Peter. So Peter, let me turn it over to you to talk about journey to Kubernetes.
Sounds good.
Organization.
So everybody, like I mentioned earlier, I talk to I don't know, just a ton of people every day and every week about Kubernetes and what they're doing with Kubernetes and how they're adopting Kubernetes and where they're going with it. And the story is very similar. So let me talk to you about most corporations, and this journey to Kubernetes kind of matches my own personal journey. But let's talk about how companies in the world today are adopting Kubernetes, right? So on this journey to Kubernetes, there are people in almost every organization, whether it's enterprise architects, the developer, whether it's people in the office of the CTO, or just all kinds of different on-routes for people to think like, well, Kubernetes is changing the world. It's changing the way we deploy apps. We want to be part of that. How do we start doing that? And how is it going to benefit our company, right? So when they start this path, they're on this path to, do I want to deploy it on the cloud? Do I want to deploy it on-prem? Should I use some VMs for right now? What CNI? And they start Googling, how do I do all this stuff? And they cycle through that a little bit and they pick something, and a lot of companies pick, just going to deploy on cloud. That's fine. Ultimately, they end up with a Kubernetes cluster that's up and running, right? And then they start looking at what's next? Well, we need to deploy an app. So, I started with Nginx. A lot of people start with the Hello World apps. It doesn't really matter, but they get this YAML file, they kubectl apply -f, and then all of a sudden they got an app running and life's great. We've got our first app running in Kubernetes. It was pretty easy. Then they just decided to do something a little more complicated. What I mean by that is, they want something that's got maybe a database and maybe some web front end and looks like some of their apps. And sometimes they choose something like a WordPress as a next kind of candidate for an app. And the kubectl apply the YAML associated with WordPress, and boom, it fails instantly. Like, what happened? And you start reading at the logs, and you realize, whoa, there's persistent storage. What is persistent storage, and how do I do persistent storage in Kubernetes? So then what you do is you start Googling around Kubernetes persistent storage, and then you start figuring, oh, I got to do something about that. Kubernetes does storage a little bit different from my stateful type application. So how am I going to deal with that in my Kubernetes cluster? Then you start looking that there's Rook and there's Portworx and there's different tools out there that you can use. You can also use Kubernetes host path and different ways of it. They pick something, they deploy it. I personally started with a Kubernetes host path, and I got my WordPress app up and running. I'm really excited, right? Then the next thing that happened was, we're ready. We're ready to go down this path. We're ready to charge. And so most organizations are picking some kind of tier D application. They try to figure out, is this thing, how is it deployed today? Is it containerized? Is it running in Docker? Do I have to build Docker files? And they start looking at the app, and then they start figuring out, how to create the Docker files. And then they figure out, all right, well, we got this YAML, we can push it out. We've got Docker images, and we get that up and running in our environment. That's great. But then they start going, well, wait a minute. This might be a tier D application, but really, we have to monitor this app. And how do you do that, right? I want to know when the app is up. I want to know when the app is down. I want to know when the app is slow. All these different kinds of things that are related to monitoring, right? And Kubernetes does that differently as well. So you start Googling around on monitoring, right? And you realize there's Datadog, and they do a great job. And then you also realize that there's tools like open source, Prometheus and Grafana, and that can monitor my Kubernetes cluster and my apps. And then there's many other options, but they pick one and they start Googling, how do I deploy that? And then they deploy it, right? And maybe they did host path storage, and that's not applicable anymore. They want to do something more robust. So they jump back 2 steps and they start figuring out the persistent storage, and then get the, and then redeploy monitoring so they can have some persistent storage for my events and alarms and thresholds and things like that. But eventually they get monitoring up and running, and they're pretty excited about that. And then the developers are going, no, wait, we can't go to production yet. I need to know what's happening with the logs for my app. In most Kubernetes clusters, you have logs that are associated with every pod, but those pod logs are only available for the current pod and one prior to that. And if the pod cycles again, you lose those logs. So you got to have to manage your logs differently. Do you want to use a Splunk? Do you want to use the ELK or EFK stack? Elasticsearch and Logstash and Kibana, or do you want to use something like Loki? You have to make a decision. So you're Googling around and you make a decision, and then you try to figure out, how do I deploy that? You get it deployed. Now you've got an app, you've got monitoring, you've got logging, and so then you're moving down the path, and now you're thinking about, okay, how do we deploy this thing in a repeatable fashion? Do I want to use CI/CD tools? What CI/CD tools do I want to use? Do I want to use Jenkins X or Spinnaker, more of the Kubernetes native type tools? Or can I adapt what I'm currently using today? Like a lot of our customers are using Jenkins just native, not Jenkins X, right? So, can we use that? And then the answer is yes. And then they Google, how do I do that? And then they figure out how to do that. And now we take those YAMLs and all those build files that we created for the manual deployment, we wrap them inside of our CI/CD process, and now we can repeatedly deploy that, and that's awesome. And then we start thinking about, okay, well, if we're doing that, how do we do A/B deployments? What if I want to have different versions of my microservices in my Kubernetes cluster running inside my cluster at the same time? Maybe I want to route all my QA traffic to my new release of my software. Meanwhile, all my production traffic goes to my old. How are you going to do that? Do you want to be able to roll forward and test the new version, or enroll back? And how are you going to plan to do that kind of stuff? A lot of people then start thinking about, okay, well, there's Istio. That looks complicated, and it is, but it's awesome. And there's Linkerd, a little simpler, but again, those are a couple of the options out there. A lot of our customers start looking at this, but then they pause. They go, wait a minute, right? How do I need to do this now? I just want to get this app in production. I want to move it. So sometimes they skip this step, right? And then they, start planning for that in the later environment. So then they might get their app deployed. They might create a new Kubernetes cluster, deploy all the other stuff that they have already deployed into that new Kubernetes cluster. This is a development one. And then they start testing Linkerd or Istio in that environment for your service mesh. Okay. And then we're trying to get into production, and information security gets involved, right? Well, and they start asking all kinds of questions. Well, this is a production environment, and are you collecting any PCI data? Do you have appropriate red and green zones defined for your PCI data? Red, is your data at rest and data in flight encrypted. In green zones, no data that's PCI related is okay then, right? Who has access to this production cluster? Is it just your SRE teams? Is it your developers? Do you have a DevOps model where kind of a lot of people have it? How do you control who can start and stop things in your production environment? So then you start thinking about identity management. Do you want to use DEX? Do you want to use an OIDC backend and authenticate against Keycloak, and SREs have access to production and developers have access to dev, and QA has a different set of Kubernetes clusters? You have to start answering and thinking about these kinds of questions. So, you know, then you start implement, you do some Googling, you figure it out, you implement one of these things, you get it up and running, right? And now you're starting to build this ecosystem of tools around just your Kubernetes cluster that you started with, because that's where you're aiming at. And then you're starting to ask the question, I think we're ready. I think we're ready to go, right? And many times you are. But then somebody says, well, wait a minute. Before we go to production, maybe we should start considering things in day two operations, right? You know, what happens if I'm running on Kubernetes 1.15, and so one of my developers needs a feature in Kubernetes 1.16? Or what if 1.16 is too old and I want to go straight to 1.18? How do I upgrade my Kubernetes cluster? How do I do it in production, right? How do I manage that whole upgrade process? What happens if a worker node goes offline? What happens if etcd crashes or loses quorum? Can I still maintain and run that cluster? And so this starts to bring in a lot of other questions, and these usually come from our SRE teams, right? And people that are maintaining the application in a production environment. But honestly, you know, you're probably getting there, and then all of a sudden you're ready, you got this app, and then you run into a production outage. So I'm going to tell you a story about Platform 9's production outage. It happened to us. It's an interesting story, but I think it tells the story of the complexity around Kubernetes cluster and how it makes you think differently about things. Okay, so this is a true story with Platform 9. We have a Platform 9 free tier. Go to our website, check it out, log into it, create your own Kubernetes cluster, free forever. But a year ago, or whenever we started developing this, we had some problems with it, right? We were using a Kubernetes cluster to manage a state for our customers' control planes to manage their Kubernetes clusters. And we started seeing things, Kubernetes node not ready. So you do a kubectl get nodes, and all of a sudden you realize that the node's not ready. Well, what's going on? So the first reaction is, okay, let's take a look. We realize that the node's not ready, our jobs are failed, applications are reporting API 500s, ingress and is up, but the apps are failing. So our next kind of response to this was, wait a minute, let's SSH to that worker node and start to figure out what's going on. And in our case, we couldn't SSH. The box was completely hung. So our reaction to that was, we need to build better monitoring. We need to understand what's happening at the app level, at the host level, right, over time, from CPU memory and disk and other metrics that we manage, right, to get a picture of what's happening until this outage occurs. So we built that monitoring in, and that took some time. And we had a huge team, right? We had our chief architect, we had our CTO, and part of our engineering team dedicated for a couple of weeks just on solving this particular problem, right? Move forward, please. Oh, there we go. So then we started having worker nodes not ready again, and we're starting to dig into logs. So one of the things that we did as a reaction, to this was node optimization. We started pinning CPUs for the OS, dedicating a certain percentage of memory to the OS as well. And that was great, because as soon as this worker node not ready happened again, we're able to SSH into the box. So that's great. Now we're in the box, we're figuring out what's going on, and we realize kubelets failed, and our apps are still failed, and all the other kind of things. So then we realized, whoa, wait a minute, we need to start putting limits on the pods that we create, right? So we set up a mission controller. We set default limits for about 80% of our pods. There were other pods out there that we needed to study better, right? What are they doing? How are they consuming memory? How are they cleaning things up? You know, and what's happening with that particular pod. So we set that emission controller for 80% of our pods. We set some very specific pod limits for other applications, and we started watching it again. And then we started having a cascading effect. It got worse and worse and worse. What happened was we got a node not ready. All the pods that were on that node, Kubernetes does what Kubernetes does best and started moving pods around within our Kubernetes cluster. That's great. So we moved that around, and then we got another node not ready. So Kubernetes did it again, and all of a sudden that pushed those pods around to other worker nodes in our Kubernetes cluster. And we had multiple nodes starting to go offline, and this just kept getting worse and worse and worse over time. And not a recommended best practice, we ended up killing that development cluster and redeploying all of our apps so we could get to a kind of a known state. And by the way, this still happened, but we started getting into it and we started learning, right? And as we were learning about what was happening in this particular worker node not ready, we saw the kubelet was not ready, and the reason was plague is not healthy. Wait a minute, what is plague? So we stopped. We Googled around, figured out what plague was. It's the pod lifecycle event generator, right? And she has the ability kind of to control and let kubelet run. And logs were failing. We can't exec into the box, but now we know what's kind of happening, right? And ultimately, the Kubernetes cluster that we were running on at the time had 5 masters, 79 worker nodes, 6,250 pods, and about 13,000 services running on top of Flannel. Now, if you dig into a worker node, that worker node is running kubeproxy, it's running Flannel, it's running kubelet, and all these things that are running on that particular worker node are in contention for IP tables rules. As we started to look at it, we had tens of thousands of IP tables rules, and the Kubernetes processes simply couldn't keep up. So we started looking at how we could optimize and make this better, and IPVS was one of the solutions that helped us make it better. But the idea here is now you've seen what a real production outage can look like in a Kubernetes cluster, right? So, it's complicated. And we learned a lot of different things, right? So first thing is Kubernetes makes you think differently. It makes you think differently about everything that you do with your apps. Whether you're managing those apps, is my app healthy and running? Am I monitoring my health endpoints? Right? How I monitor my Kubernetes cluster and monitor my app, because they're very interrelated. In my story I just told you, that app took down a worker node. So you have to be very careful there. How do you deliver apps? How do you troubleshoot them? Right? All kinds of different things there. Platform 9, we even got to at one point, was Kubernetes the right decision for our corporation? As it turns out, it was, and is, and we're still using it today for our free tier. So, I'm gonna plug that again. Go to our website and try it. We spent hours with our most expensive talent in our company, correlating logs and timestamps. Our logging wasn't at the right level. Monitoring wasn't at the right level. We weren't monitoring the right things. We had incorrect pod policies, and it took a long time. So we started asking our customers, right? Are you staffed to solve these kinds of problems, right? Are your SREs trained to dig in at all of these different kinds of levels? Can your revenue generating applications withstand this kind of outage? What's your backup plan, right? When there is an outage, who's going to support that outage? Are you going to rely just internally? If 79 or 70 some percent of our respondents said that they were going to do self-managed, so then it's on you to figure this out, right? And I think it's it's very helpful if you have the phone a friend and somebody to call. And I like to get people thinking about, where are you on this Kubernetes journey? I think everybody that's on this call, on this webinar today, is on that journey somewhere, and you're making these decisions, right? Are you running production apps? So things to consider. Vamsi, do you have any thoughts on the journey to Kubernetes before I move forward?
No, Peter, I think you summed it up right. I mean, when you start to build the platform, not every shop has the ability to kind of take that holistic view or understands how things are going. I think most customers that we work with have built a couple of apps, and they face all these issues in terms of the management, not just from the perspective of the infrastructure, but also the application-centric management. And then as they started to develop in microservices, you run into this whole issue where your app is not just one big monolithic stack on one big machine, but it's all these different pieces that are working in different servers. And then the challenge is then how do you ensure that high degree of efficiency, density, and also predictable performance, right? So again, there have been some well-documented stories of companies moving away from Kubernetes because it wasn't the right, they felt, given the complexity of all they ran into, that it wasn't the right tool for them to use or the right platform for them to use. But again, the other thing I'll caution people on is if it's generally true for 80% of tech market, it's probably true for your shop as well, right? Not investing in Kubernetes means it's going to have a direct impact on your business, maybe 2 years down or 3 years down or 5 years down, right? I mean, the ability to not be able to scale up or scale down based on your business requirements is going to make those things be more difficult. So again, if you're running into these issues from a dev and from an ops standpoint, then you have to basically relook at how you're doing things. But also, are you staffed in the right level to solve these problems? I think that's a key question, right? And it's just not outages, but it's also the fact that you are going to build a platform for the future. So Kubernetes is the mainframe, and it's the Linux of the data center for the next 20 years. So the question then becomes, how do you make sure that the investments you're putting in from the perspective of your pipeline, the pipeline technologies, with whether it's Jenkins with Spinnaker or Jenkins with Jenkins X, what kind of Git are you going to use? And what are the kind of people you need to run these apps at scale? I think it's a key question that almost every customer will have answer, every enterprise will have answer.
Awesome. Thanks, Vamsi. And I think, what I'm seeing is more and more people moving towards Kubernetes and trying to figure out how. I haven't heard too many people moving away. But yeah, so I think that's where the future is. So, all right, let's move on to the next slide, right? And so what we're seeing is, right, is for a lot of our customers, the answer to to some of these challenges in running Kubernetes in production in your own environments is a managed service. They're looking at, having that lifeline to call, somebody to be there for them, right? And Platform 9 provides to you a managed service, right? We offer a SaaS managed service around deployment and management of Kubernetes, but we also make a lot of the decisions simple for you. So we have an automated way of deploying Kubernetes. We can deploy Kubernetes in the cloud, in various AWS, Azure, Google, that kind of thing. We can also deploy the same Kubernetes in your local data centers on VMs or in your bare metal environment. So we can deploy and manage Kubernetes with a single interface wherever you want. We also come out of the box with monitoring capabilities, right? When you're deploying a Kubernetes cluster with Platform 9, we also allow you to say, hey, I want to monitor this, and please deploy Prometheus and Grafana, making that simple for you so you don't need to take the steps to figure that out. We also have solutions with logging, being able to automate the deployment of FluentBit and FluentD for you, right? We have out-of-the-box solutions that we work with for container storage, right? We can work with Portworx, we can work with Rook, and we've got tutorials on how to do these different things with our Platform 9. We have different choices for CNI, and we've got choices and demos and tutorials on how to deploy CI/CD solutions for Kubernetes as well. But the key is we've got the world-class support. We've done it before. We've seen many, many very difficult challenges of our own and with our customers, right? And we guarantee every Kubernetes cluster that we deploy with an SLA. Vamsi, did you want to add anything to this slide?
No, I agree with pretty much all that's been laid out, Peter. And I think we'll talk about the architecture in a minute, and then and the benefits it provides. But I think a couple of key things they are going to be monitoring. We're seeing a lot of customers, not wanting to use expensive software stacks like Datadog or other APM platforms like AppDynamics or whatever have you. With Kubernetes, they are starting to look at things like Prometheus, but again, there's issues in terms of how that whole time series database is set up, and that we're doing a lot of work in the community with the operators, but also as part of the managed service. But I think monitoring and logging as well is another big topic where instead of using a Splunk or using a system like Elastic, a paid system, can they get by and do most things in the open source world using an EFK stack as well? So again, from our perspective, monitoring and logging are not things we're in any shape or form, not emphasizing on. That's going to be a key area because all that speaks to the manageability of the platform once you build it. So, no, agreed on pretty much all of these different these rectangles and the points in each.
Thanks, Vamsi. All right, so what does Platform 9 do for you? Right, Platform 9 delivers to you rock solid, production ready Kubernetes. It delivers to you Kubernetes, upstream Kubernetes, straight from the GitHub repo, right, offered to you as a SaaS managed service. We have monitoring alerts technology built into the product, built into the Prometheus and Grafana instances, so we can share alerts and alarms with your operations teams as well as with our operations teams at the same time. And you can think of Platform 9's team, and we've got 15 or 17 certified Kubernetes administrators on staff right now, as a team that has your back when maintaining the uptime and availability of your Kubernetes cluster. We'll jump on the phone with you. If you're having a worker node go offline, we'll create a Zoom call. We'll jump on the phone with you. We will help you troubleshoot that worker node, that your Kubernetes cluster, until it's back in full service, right? So that's part of the Platform 9's day 2 operations, right? We've got full automation around deployment, management, monitoring, maintenance, upgrades, and release management. In fact, I'd say we've got the simplest zero-touch Kubernetes upgrade in the industry. It's very, very easy for us to, select a Kubernetes cluster through our API or through our user interface and execute a upgrade on that particular cluster. It's fully integrated. It's going to run where you guys are in your customers or you are doing business, right? In other words, we can deploy in the cloud. We can deploy in your local data center. We can deploy, where you want to run Kubernetes clusters. Even at the edge, we have a lot of our customers spanning and managing Kubernetes clusters across thousands of locations around the United States. It's got a financially backed SLA for the availability of every one of your Kubernetes clusters, 7/24/365, right? We are part of the Kubernetes security SIG. SIG is special interest group, and that allows us to get access to vulnerabilities to the Kubernetes API or the Kubernetes tools before they're released to the general public. We work with Kubernetes open source development and our own development teams to put together a fix. So on day 0, we have a patch available for you. And we are in the final audit of our PCI compliance for Kubernetes, and we should be able to announce that imminently. So I'm real excited about that. Okay, so let's talk about Platform 9's managed Kubernetes a little bit and our architecture and our approach. We deploy a management plane, a user interface, and an API in our cloud, right? That cloud or that instance of that management plane is dedicated to each of our customers. We isolate networking, we isolate all of the processes, nothing shared between our customers, right? And that allows you to deploy Kubernetes clusters in different areas, right? As I mentioned before, we can deploy on bare metal. We even have solutions that will manage the bare metal. I probably should have said bare OS. We can deploy on bare OS and deploy Kubernetes clusters on there, but we can also manage the bare metal, deploy the OS, and have that bootstrap into a Kubernetes cluster through our automation. We can deploy Kubernetes in virtualized environments such as OpenStack or VMware, and we can deploy Kubernetes clusters into cloud providers like AWS or Google or Azure, right? And the way we do this when we deploy into a cloud is we deploy Kubernetes clusters on top of, in the AWS case, EC2 instances. We create the VPC or use an existing VPC. We create security groups. We create everything that is needed to deploy that Kubernetes cluster. But what that means is when we deploy a Kubernetes cluster in our cloud environments, it's the exact same version as that you would be deploying in your local data center. Okay. So next we will run through a little bit on how we deploy onto these environments. So we ask our customers to bring a physical or virtual machine, a Linux OS, Red Hat, Ubuntu, or CentOS are what we support. And then we give you a dedicated management plane. And we then, you can, through our API or through our management plane or through simple scripting tools, you can download Platform 9's agent and deploy it into these physical or virtual machines in your environment. And that'll allow you to then apply a role to that agent and customize it into a Kubernetes cluster, right? So we can deploy these clusters. We give you that single pane of glass to manage and deploy Kubernetes clusters wherever you're running those clusters, AWS, Google, and et cetera, right? By the way, the agent that we deploy communicates on outbound port 443 only, right? So there's no inbound access to these environments. And then, so we manage the deployment. We have deep automation around the deployment of Kubernetes clusters. We have built-in monitoring both through our host agent and also through Prometheus and Grafana and Alert Manager that we deploy with our Kubernetes clusters. We've got diagnostics. We've got our support and our customer success teams that are dedicated to our customers to keeping your Kubernetes clusters online and help you troubleshoot these things. And then we do Kubernetes versioning as a service as well. So you can select any one of these Kubernetes clusters here and automatically deploy and upgrade them. Okay. Oh, Vamsi, conclusions.
No, so just a point to make, right? Number one, the Kubernetes journey is a difficult one. And as we've seen from working with hundreds of customers, these issues span everything from how to do your app development, how do you do your CI/CD, and ensure that you have consistent deployments across whatever cloud platforms are using that you're leveraging. The other thing is that to leverage pure open source, right? Basically, the challenge there is you don't want to be locked into a vendor or onto a public cloud. You want to be able to do things in such a way that you're using one version of the platform that is extensible and usable by your customers. And just keep in mind that there's no business value in just spinning up clusters, right? I mean, you could go down to open source, download a couple of tools and try to go use them. But once you go to production, you'll see all sorts of issues around etcd and networking and storage and all of that. And again, we have a free tier that you can use to design and architect and drive proof of concepts in this space. And please automate as much as possible to reduce your human cost and the cost of basically your scripting and all of that. So, and again, based on the right use case for the application, use a mix of whatever you want to use, VMs, bare metal, containerized workloads. Again, keep your operations low touch to drive efficiencies at scale. So Peter, anything to add to our conclusion before we take questions from the audience?
I think we should jump into the questions. There's quite a lot of them today.
Yep. Okay.
All right, folks, this is Kamesh. I just wanted to, there are lots of questions. Thanks, keep them coming. The first question here is, how many users do you see using Jenkins X, especially in production?
So Vamsi, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that you got to keep in mind is when you use Jenkins, it's not essentially very focused on the containerization use case. So when you're basically deploying Jenkins with Kubernetes, you still have to go write a whole bunch of scripts to help Jenkins work with Kubernetes internals, right? Such as pods, such as rolling deployments, so on and so forth. So again, I would say that on average, Jenkins is augmented using platforms such as Jenkins X or Spinnaker, and we see about 20% of customers using that, right? And the goal is, instead of just using Jenkins with custom scripts, and you basically get a way to kind of extend Jenkins, right? The strength of Jenkins is that it's extremely strong in build management and a build server, but it's not a CD tool, right? And it does not by itself have the first-class support you need for your Kubernetes services, right? So again, I would say that about 20% of customers that we work with, as a very rough, are basically using Jenkins with Jenkins X or with Spinnaker.
Okay, next question. What are the prerequisites for PF9 agent per cluster? I guess he's asking resources probably.
Yeah, so from a resource perspective, it's very tiny. Like I said, it communicates outbound port 443. I think the memory footprint is about 40 meg on our host agents. CPU utilization is nominal. You probably won't notice it running on most Linux systems. We do update back to the Platform 9 control plane periodically with CPU, memory, and disk, and different stats about the Kubernetes cluster. But it is a very small footprint on the Kubernetes cluster, the worker nodes or master nodes.
Cool. Next question is the YAML I deploy on premises exactly the same as the YAML I deploy in the cloud?
Can be. So one of the things that Platform 9 does, one of the challenges with deploying on the cloud, is when you expose a service in the cloud, is you expose it as service type load balancer. Typically, in most Kubernetes deployments that we deploy on-prem, you can't use service type load balancer, and you end up using a service type node port or I can't think of the other one, cluster info or cluster. Anyway, and so when you deploy it in your local data center, it's a little bit different. You have to modify that YAML. With Platform 9, one of the deployment options allows you to deploy Metal LB into your Kubernetes clusters on-prem and allowing you to support things like service type load balancer. And with that, then your YAMLs would be the same. There might be different things that you might have to modify in the storage space, but in general, we try to make it as simple as possible with default storage classes and things like that to keep your YAMLs the same.
All right. Next question is about upgrades. Does the upgrade work in place? If yes, in that case, one still has to put in the work of checking if the cluster upgrade will work with the underlying services.
Yes, we do an in-place upgrade of Kubernetes. First of all, what we recommend to all of our customers is when they deploy an environment, they deploy a canary region so that they can have a small Kubernetes cluster that might be running, as an example, 115. So you can test upgrades to 116 of Kubernetes. So that's the first recommendation, is that you have that availability, and it comes with the Platform 9 service. The second thing is when we do an in-place upgrade, we do upgrade the Kubernetes cluster. And so what that means is, we'll take a master node, we'll coordinate that master node, we evacuate all the nodes and pods on that master node. We then upgrade that individual master node, we bring it back online, we cycle through the next master nodes, so on and so forth through all the master nodes. We support 1, 3, or 5 master nodes. And then ultimately, we do that for each of the worker nodes. So there's that portion of it as well. But Platform 9, as part of our managed service, we are very diligent about testing our upgrade process. So if underlying components need to be upgraded, think about etcd. If we need to go to a new version of etcd or a new version of Docker or something along those lines, we can. And we actually do the upgrade of Docker or etcd as part of our upgrade, and we migrate data as required. And we test that and we ensure it. Every Kubernetes cluster that we deploy, we've tested for a period of about 8 weeks in our own dogfooding environment to ensure that upgrades go smoothly.
Awesome. Hey, there's a question for you, Vamsi. I guess this is referring to your blog, the 7 characteristics of cloud native application architectures.
Sure.
It sounds like you did not mention Kubernetes there. Any reasons why?
Yeah, that's maybe I was trying to stay agnostic to the underlying platform because I was doing that as part of a series that had Mesos and Kubernetes, and I mentioned them. So if you look in one of the blogs in that series, there's a series on software-defined data centers. I covered like 8 technologies, right? And ranging from Kubernetes to Mesos to Yarn and the different schedulers. But again, yeah, there's no one reason. But I think since the time I've written that, it's become more and more obvious that Kubernetes is the de facto, is a winner of all those containerization wars. I mean, we still see some Mesos out there, but even now, Mesosphere or D2IQ basically is Kubernetes, Mesos spinning up Kubernetes, right? So Just today morning, I was on call with the bank, and they're basically launching Spark workloads with Kubernetes. And that's probably my fourth call this whole month, where now you're seeing big data move away from your Yarn or your Hadoop schedulers to Kubernetes. So I think you'll see some, more and more of that. But if you look at that series on software-defined data centers, you'll see Kubernetes covered there in a big way. Yeah.
Awesome. Question, does Platform 9 include a service to manage Istio?
Sure, I'll take that. So Platform 9 today we've tested it. We've used Istio. We've used Linkerd as well internally in our development Kubernetes clusters. But we do not have a managed service today that allows you to manage and upgrade and control Istio as a managed service, right? But we will be providing tutorials on how to do that sort of thing.
Awesome. One more question about security. How does, for example, AWS security / IAM interact with Kubernetes? And is that security different on-prem versus in AWS?
Sure. If I understand the question correctly, we do have a IAM rules set of a YAML that you can download from our docs website, that if you want to deploy a Kubernetes cluster into AWS, the IAM account that we are using for deploying into your AWS account needs to have those permissions. And that's, like I said, that's downloadable from our website. The on-prem when you deploy on-prem, there's no concept of necessarily of an IAM account. I could mention though that we can control access to Kubernetes clusters. We can control via integration with a backend LDAP or Active Directory or Keycloak or something like that. If a user belongs to a group, they can then use a Kubernetes cluster or a namespace within a cluster, and we have ways of managing role-based access control within those Kubernetes clusters as well.
Cool. The more questions coming in. We have only a few minutes left. Let me see what we've got here. Compared to running EKS clusters using AWS Fargate, which is the serverless compute for containers? How does Platform 9 MAS, I guess Metal as a Service, differ?
Yeah, so our Metal as a Service is ultimately designed to run in your local data center. It talks to your ILO cards or your IPMI cards inside of your servers. It allows you to boot them. It allows you to deploy an OS of your choice to those machines. It then allows you to, through cloud init scripting and some other automation that we've got, to be able to bootstrap a particular piece of metal into an OS and ultimately into a Kubernetes cluster if you wanted to. One of our customers is using Platform 9 across their retail stores, where they've got 2 compute nodes in every store. And today they're using the Metal as a Service centrally from a local data center to deploy the OS in all of those stores and bootstrap it into an OpenStack environment, which is our other offering. But ultimately, they like the Platform 9 because of the ability to manage Metal and the ability to later redeploy that same set of servers in their stores, all done remotely with zero touch from people, and have it bootstrap into a Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah, there are a few more questions. I think we'll take just one more before we wrap up here. The next question regards Red Hat Enterprise Linux. RHEL 8 does not support IP tables. Does Kubernetes use NF tables in RHEL 8? Will it work with RHEL 8?
Good question. I don't know what our current support matrix goes. I just looked in for our CentOS support. We only support up to CentOS 7.8. I know that our next release of software is looking at supporting CentOS 8 as well as Red Hat 8, but we'd have to look at how we're managing the IP tables relationship. I don't know the answer to that question.
All right. Okay, I think we're just about time here. We do want to announce the winner. The winner for the prize today is Werner Pisar, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. P-I-S-A-R, Project Manager, Senior Project Manager at Infor. Congratulations for the prize. And with that, we should be wrapping up. Anything you guys want to just mention as we close this up?
Yeah, one last set of thoughts. Please check out platform9.com. Please feel free to sign up for Platform 9's free tier. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm Peter at platform9.com. We're here for you. We're excited about Kubernetes, and looking forward to more and more people leveraging Kubernetes out there in the world.
Thank you.
Else?
Great. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks, Peter. And see you all on a future webinar soon. Thank you.